I just want to thank UNC, thank the Transatlantic Masters Program for having me today. Getting that email from Sarah was an absolute joy. So great to be back. It's probably not the last time you'll hear this, but I wish we could be in person. It's great to see you all, but I'm certainly looking forward to the day when I can come back to Chapel Hill and we can have these conversations in person. So the Transatlantic Trends Project. So I think it'd probably be best to give you a little bit of background on the project itself. This is a partnership between the Bertelsmann Foundation, my organization, and the German Marshall Fund and Institut Montaigne. And interestingly, you know, we have this really cool project, but it wasn't really planned like this. Going back to September, actually almost a year ago, last year, this was when we were going through the questions for the survey. About a week before I joined, we got the first results back, which were meant to be the only results. We wrote our analyses in February. We were about 2 weeks out before three physical rollout events in Berlin, Paris, and DC, when the full weight impact of the coronavirus hit both the United States and Europe. And, you know, overnight, the project was kind of, it was just unclear where the project was headed. I mean, not only were we set back in terms of having planned out the travel and the logistics and everything for these physical rollout events, the results of the survey, you know, a cataclysmic event, something like a global pandemic, certainly called into question some of the results that we had just recorded. So it was kind of a difficult moment there for a second. But you know, luckily, right after that initial punch, we were able to get back up and, as a partnership, figure out how to make the most of the project. And the decision was to take around 8 questions that we thought were the most impacted by the virus, by the pandemic, and to reintroduce them in the field in May. So now we have this really, really interesting pre and post coronavirus view on a number of key challenges impacting the transatlantic relationship today. And, you know, and just besides the project itself, I'd just like to emphasize that, you know, the topic is, of course, related to transatlantic relations, but the partnership itself was, you know, it's about as transatlantic as you can get. We were the German partners, the Bertelsmann Foundation, GMF, the American partners, and Institut Montaigne, the French partners. And I think over the course of, you know, this past year, overcoming a lot of these difficulties, we've really established a solid partnership. So that's just really positive. Now, the project itself is split into 5 distinct sections. The state of transatlantic relations, international security and defense, international trade, relations with China, and digital trends. Now, I won't cover all of that in this presentation. I'm going to try to hit each point and provide some sense of coherency towards the end because the last 3 sections are quite varied. But in any case, I could provide the link afterwards, or maybe we could send the link to the full report to you all afterwards so you can see it. Now, the goal of the survey is really threefold. One, it's to better understand how our societies, how citizens, average citizens, perceive global challenges today. 2, we want to see how societies assess, and you know, you'll see this at certain points in time in the survey, you know, especially related to trade and security, how citizenries challenge their government's policies. There seems to be a disconnect between how citizens feel and what the policies of the government actually are. And 3, you know, based on some of the results, we can set a positive agenda. There is indeed consensus, despite this being a very difficult time for transatlantic relations. There is consensus on a number of key issues. So that's certainly, you know, the positive way of looking at this. Now, let's see here. Try to navigate this. I believe you're seeing the methodology now. You know, I just want to give you the basics here of the methodology of the program. We used the services of Kantar. They were based in Paris. And, just to give you an idea, nationally representative sample of the population aged 18 and older, about 1,000 respondents in each country in both waves. So the first round of surveying was in mid-January. The second round of surveying was in mid-May. And, that's important to take into consideration when looking at these results, because naturally, as a result of events that were taking place at those specific points in time, that we saw how different trends were impacting the results. But I also just want to say that for the question and answer session, I do not have a background in statistics, so any sort of really detailed methodological questions, I can certainly take them and get back to you. We actually, for the virtual rollout event, had a representative from Kantar join us so that he'd be available for any sort of really detailed methodological questions. Yes. So, with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. All right. So the first question we have here, and this is from the State of Transatlantic Relations: which actor is currently the most influential in global affairs? Now, as you can see, there were supermajorities in France, Germany, and the United States, recognizing the United States as the most influential power on the international stage. And, in the US case, we see 6% for the EU and China, a measly 3% for Russia, which was kind of surprising considering how much you see Russia in the daily news here. Leaving a whopping 85% of Americans who see their own country, see the United States as the most influential power. In Germany and France, we see around two-thirds of citizens who, respondents in both countries, who share that same opinion, so slightly less than in the United States. In Germany, we see a much more multipolar view of the global balance of power. The EU comes in at 20%, China at 12%, and Russia at 6%, which was the highest of all three countries. In France, we see a similar multipolar view, but not to the same extent as in Germany. Now, in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak, so we'll see this, here's the before and after. So just for your reference, I'll show you before so you can get a good view at it, and then after, so you can see the changes. After the coronavirus outbreak, we see pretty significant shifts. As you can imagine, the influence of China has risen in all three countries. And it appears as though this comes at the expense of US influence on the global stage. The points that were formerly assigned to the United States have been lost to China. In France, we see a 15% percentage point increase for China, a 12 percentage point decrease for the United States. In Germany, an 8-point increase versus an 8-point decrease, similar in the United States. So we see here, there's this clear shift in the US's decreasing influence and China's increasing influence. And, thinking about May, around this time when surveying was going on, there were discussions really in all three countries that revolved around China's extremely powerful presence on the international stage. I mean, looking at 6%, that's very, very low percentage point considering how influential China actually is, how dependent our countries are on China in economic terms. Global supply chains were absolutely ravaged as a result of the pandemic. In terms of the production and procurement of medical equipment as well, this was commonly referred to in the media at that point in time. So, at the same time, we also see a remarkable absence of U.S. leadership. And this was around the time that the United States was threatening, or it might have been around the time exactly when the United States withdrew from the WHO. So, certainly that's something that you have to take into consideration when looking at the shifts that we see here. And then also, the last point I think is, we see that in the United States, France, and Germany, there's this increasingly perceived, world as this competition between China and the United States, which will have impacts, and you'll see this later on in the survey. Let's see here. All right. So for this question, we asked respondents, it's a similar question, but we focused on the European level. Which country is most influential in Europe? In January, Germany was clearly perceived as the most influential power in both Germany and France. 63% and 64% in Germany and France, respectively. But you'll see something a little peculiar off to the right side of your screen. I mean, when we saw these results, we were shocked. You just had to laugh. I mean, the United States, 53% of American respondents in the United States find that the United Kingdom is the most influential country in Europe. And, really you have to think, well, how could that be? I mean, for us, for those joining the call, who are pretty finely tuned into transatlantic affairs, into the news cycle, Brexit, of course, has dominated. I mean, I remember back to when I was a student. I mean, that was the talk of the town. Every other week we were having talks about this. So, for us, I think it's incredibly surprising to see this, but that is the case. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreak, we see pretty big boosts in Germany, and naturally this is a result of Germany's relatively effective coronavirus policies, response, I should say. Also in addition, thinking about this time specifically around April and May, this was when we were seeing talks about coronavirus bonds, about Euro bonds, how, pretty aggressive approaches, radical approaches from Germany and France, considering, okay, how can we come together and take care of the economic problems that are, a result of this pandemic as a collective European body, and that certainly went around the news cycles pretty prevalently during that time. Interestingly, in the United States, and I think this is a testament to the validity of these results, you see the second time around that the United States finds that the United Kingdom is still the most influential in Europe. And we talked a little bit about this as a partnership. Where is this coming from? Of course, the United States and the United Kingdom have there are special historic cultural ties, but maybe something to consider for the Q&A session. All right. And the last question from the State of Transatlantic Relations is, what issues are most important for transatlantic cooperation? Now, we see here that before COVID, and luckily on this screen, we've got before and after on both sides of the screen, so you can take your time and take a look and see what the differences are. So before the COVID-19 outbreak, climate change was the clear winner in terms of most important challenges that the transatlantic community can face together. 34% in France, 29% in Germany, and 19% in the United States. So slightly larger in France and Germany than the United States. In the United States, there was almost this divide between climate change and counterterrorism and intelligence sharing, which is slightly concerning. But when you actually break down the data, when you look at the detailed Excel documents that show the breakdowns in terms of political party age differences, that's where it really gets interesting. In the United States, of course, there's a predictable partisan divide. Republicans were more in favor of were more likely to indicate that counterterrorism intelligence sharing was the most important area of transatlantic cooperation, whereas Democrats were largely more likely to indicate climate change. You see this divide also in terms of age differences. Younger Americans were more likely to find climate change as the most pressing issue that the transatlantic community can face together, and those views dropped off considerably as the age increased. Now, interestingly, after COVID-19, we introduced health crises as an option for respondents to select, and we see this interesting shift here. Whereas France and Germany, whereas the United States is pushing for more cooperation between the transatlantic community on facing health crises, you don't see the same enthusiasm from France and Germany. And most strikingly, when you look at climate change, the Germans and the French really haven't taken their eye off the ball here. We can see 28% and 26% for climate change. And I mean, this is slightly embarrassing as an American to look at this, but if you look at the results on the right side of the screen here, we can see that climate change not only dropped down to second, but it's actually tied for third place in terms of the most pressing challenges that we are facing, today. So just interesting results indeed, but it's slightly concerning to see the priorities, the difference in priorities between France and the European partners. So now we'll move on to the international security and defense section of the publication. And the question here is, how important is NATO in the security of your country? Now, I think, the most surprising thing here is there is overwhelming support for NATO within the United States, despite what you're hearing from the current administration. There seems to be that disconnect. We talked a little bit earlier about this disconnect between citizens and their government's policies. It's clear from these results that the administration is not necessarily representative of the American people. And yes, so in France, we see that there's a little bit more skepticism of NATO, and that certainly, I think, is you could have probably anticipated that. We see that in Germany, there's overwhelming support for NATO, but in the United States, it's interesting. Again, there is this, normally you see pretty distinct partisan divides in a number of areas in the survey, especially on digital issues. But in this case, you see there's really bipartisan support between Democrats, Republicans, and independents as well for support for NATO. Okay. The question here is, should your government increase or decrease its engagement? Should increase or decrease its engagement with the following security issues? Now, we can see right off the bat that there are concerns over restricting Iran's access to nuclear weapons. Now, I think it's especially interesting, again, in the U.S. case, considering the U.S. withdrawal from JCPOA, that, more Americans favor action, maybe stricter action, or increasing involvement to restricting Iran's nuclear capabilities. So there's this sort of contradiction between the actions of the administration and what citizens actually would like. And again, when we look at this question, we have to keep in mind what was happening at this point in time. These are results from mid-January, and just a couple weeks prior was the killing of Iranian General Soleimani by U.S. forces in Iraq via drone strike. This was, the dangerous precedent that action set that occurred just before surveying. And of course, at that point in time, it sparked debates on both sides of the Atlantic. It really dominated news cycles about what to do or what implications this would have. Now in France, you can see across the board that there is a general want to decrease involvement in a lot of these, security issues. You see this especially in the Sahel, the Afghanistan conflict. Really, it's all across the board, except for in regard to Iran's restricting Iran's access to nuclear weapons. In the United States, I'll shift over to the United States here. Again, we see that huge 40% there for restricting Iran's access to nuclear weapons. But then when you go down, you see that those figures sort of drop off. There's I'm not necessarily sure if I would call it war fatigue, but there's, certainly when looking at the figures for Afghanistan specifically, there's a split number there, but it's the lowest in Afghanistan, which, certainly makes sense. Now in Germany, this appears to be very surprising. We see that in Germany there is this real want, this real desire to increase involvement in international security issues. Now I think here we have to think about the question, and this is related to methodology. This is related to how we asked this question, so it's something to take into consideration. We see security, but you also have to look at that word engagement. What is engagement exactly? And this has been a talking point from the Germans for quite a long time in relation to the 2% NATO debate, 2% defense spending debate, that Germany actually spends quite a lot of money on peacekeeping, on rebuilding, on the types of activities that come after or are related to security, but not specifically related to military action. So again, when you look at the results, when you break down the results and you see the divides along party lines, it's quite interesting, because you'll see that the Greens, for example, are really have this desire for increasing engagement, but you have to consider that, what exactly is engagement? Interesting nonetheless. Okay. Now, let's see here. Now, for these questions specifically, I'm going to cover 3 questions from 3 distinct parts of the survey, which, just to provide a little bit of coherency, we bounce from the 3 sections are trade, China's rising influence, and digital trends. And of course, those topics by themselves are quite distinct, but we want to provide a little bit of some sense of coherency here. So I've decided to select questions that have implications on trade. So that's going to be I'll try to make it the common thread throughout this section. So the first question here is, how balanced is the economic relationship between the European Union and the United States? And for this question, again, we do have pre and post coronavirus results. And again, as you left and right side of the screen. Before the pandemic, more Americans and Germans felt that the transatlantic economic relationship was balanced, equally balanced. The Germans a bit more than the Americans, as you can see. And a near majority of French respondents found that the relationship benefits the United States more. Now, the results coming from the United States were especially surprising to look, and it kind of goes back to the figures that we saw in NATO. Despite years of trade disputes and anti-European rhetoric in economic terms, there have been points in time that this administration has said that the Europeans are worse than the European Union is worse than China when it comes to trade. Despite a lot of this rhetoric, in economic terms, we see that it hasn't had really a significant impact on shaping American public opinion. After the introduction of the coronavirus, opinions largely remain the same in the French and German cases. The results for May are nearly identical to the results that we recorded in January. And surprisingly, there was a notable increase in the number of Americans who find that the US actually benefits more than the European Union, not less. So all this to say, the impacts of the coronavirus crisis on trade specifically, and thinking about what was taking place at this point in time, the second round of surveying was in mid-May. This was right around the time that there were intense trade disputes between the transatlantic partners on medical equipment and vaccines. So despite all of this, we can see that this really didn't impact views on the transatlantic economic partnership on really either side of the Atlantic. Now, interestingly, you see this trend here, and I don't include this question in the survey. Again, we'll provide the link at either at the end of this presentation or maybe afterwards. But you see this trend in a different question. It's we asked a question about how respondents felt about a transatlantic trade agreement. And despite the failure of TTIP, really even before the Trump administration came to be, despite that, we see a clear majority in each country supporting a trade deal. And those views have actually not changed over the course of the coronavirus crisis. The question here is, we heard a little bit earlier about, how respondents feel about China's rising influence on the global stage. We see that China's rising influence is indeed rising. For this question, we asked respondents to characterize that development. About a year ago, China was designated a systemic rival to the European Union after 15 years of strategic partnership. Since the start of the Trump administration, there has been a highly publicized ongoing trade war with implications on both sides of the Atlantic between the United States and China. And it seems that really the conflicts regarding China in the areas of trade and technology, they're starting to register with the general public. And they were starting to register before the coronavirus pandemic occurred, or really the full weight of the coronavirus was felt on the international stage. So in the January survey, about half of American, German, and French respondents found China's rising influence to be a negative development. However, at the time, in all three countries, there was a generational divide on the issue. This is really interesting. And just aside, possibly I could provide the Excel documents for the TAM class if you're interested in looking at the exact breakdowns, but that's something I guess we can talk about a little bit later. Younger respondents were more likely to be open to Chinese influence, while older respondents in all three countries viewed China's rising influence negatively. 4 months later, and this is so shifting to the right side of the screen here, 4 months later, post-coronavirus, negative views of China's rising influence have increased significantly. And, as you can imagine, in some cases by double digits. We see here +10, +11, +11 on the left side of the graph there. And so there's consensus across the board that really the views of China have these negative views of China have increased. And the generational divide that we saw in January has evaporated completely. Interestingly, across the political spectrum, not only in the United States, across the political spectrum in Germany and in France, negative views have increased as well. I believe in each party. So of course, for those who indicated a party, in each party there is over 50%. There's a clear majority of respondents who indicated a party that indicated that China's rising influence is a negative development. So all this to say, before the pandemic, despite divergences between transatlantic partners at the national level over issues such as trade, technology, of course 5G comes to mind, there was a consensus among the citizenry of negative views of China's rising influence before. So quite interesting. And then, of course, after the coronavirus outbreak, we see that China's reputation has suffered within the transatlantic community, and there's consensus across the board, politically, generationally, in each country. Now, the last question here is, what do you think of the tax rate paid in your country by large US technology companies? Now, as you can see, a large part of respondents in all three countries support increasing taxes on big American tech companies. course, with this question specifically, we're thinking about Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. The tendency is a bit higher in France than in Germany or the United States, but the figures are quite similar. We see a plurality of 38 to 43% in all countries in favor. The French government, interestingly, has taken a pretty aggressive approach in this regard, really leading the way in Europe at this point in time by implementing a digital tax last year, which has not been implemented fully yet, but if implemented, it could bring in hundreds of millions of euros in tax revenues from these companies specifically. And this is becoming more and more important in our post-coronavirus outbreak world. Okay, perfect, back on the screen. Considering an absolute depletion of tax revenues across the board and really in all three countries. Now, let's see here. Yes, in the United States, we see that there is a general view that support for lower taxes is higher than in France and Germany. It's double the German percent at 16%. But interestingly, when you look at this, and this is a trend across all of the digital items specifically, that there is a very distinct partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats. In this case, we see that half of Democrats are in favor of higher taxes compared to just 30% of Republicans. So in any case, we see that support for increasing taxes for US tech companies is high within the transatlantic community, slightly lower in the United States, mixed, I should say. And really this topic, the reason we chose this question is because this topic has significant impacts on US-EU trade relations. It's had it in the past, really since that French law was passed in July 2019, and it's growing in importance. The reason that it was not implemented is because there are negotiations going on at the international level on digital taxation. And as recently as, I believe it was in mid-June, the United States withdrew from those negotiations. I know there's a little bit of back and forth now about whether the United States is actually participating in those discussions, but in the event that the United States does not move forward with a global solution to this issue, we could see a push for that French law to be implemented fully, and in which case that would reignite trade disputes, those threats of tariffs that have been coming from both sides of the Atlantic.